Call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, this is a bill of 180 pages and 40 changes in 235 clauses and 8 schedules. It was introduced on Tuesday, and here we are on Thursday asked to support it without any prior consultation whatsoever. This is a bill which will take time to study and assess, so New Zealand First will neither support it nor oppose it until we have done that properly. We will have no choice but to abstain at this stage, and we will decide later whether we will vote yes or no. And Mr Speaker, I note that the Maori Party has said it will support the bill unconditionally at this stage, and they got what they referred to as, quote, pre-bill consultation, unquote. And yet they've said they still want more demands, unspecified demands, yet to be discussed. We won't know what those are until we hear them a lot later. But we know that they're always looking for some sort of advantage for Maori over other New Zealanders. And we don't think that's clever. We think those are separatist attitudes, and they smack of division and of favouritism, and New Zealand First will never support any of that. But we will support Maori for fair and equal treatment in all things, just as we do for all other New Zealanders. We think it's deplorable that important legislation of this kind has been subjected to some kind of tit-for-tat negotiation behind closed doors between the government and the Maori Party, and I'll have some more to say about that later. Yet it is New Zealand First which has actually been the main playmaker here, because the truth is that if Winston Peters had not won the Northland by-election, National would have had the votes to pass this legislation as it was originally intended. This is a hugely watered-down version of it. The truth is that there would have been a full attack on the RMA's main provisions set out in sections 5, 6 and 7 on the pretext that compromising the RMA in that way was justified and necessary to ensure economic development and the provision of adequate housing. And what poppycock that was. The truth is that the RMA's principal sections were never a roadblock to appropriate economic development and housing provision. They were never a roadblock to that. And the attack was nothing more than a barely disguised assault on a tried and tested and highly respected resource management regime, putting profit and commercial interests effectively ahead of fundamental environmental protection. National had in fact already begun to argue that it wanted those things to be equal in the Act, but in practice it would have been impossible to do so, and commercial interests would have prevailed and the environment would have come off second best. Anyone with half a brain, Mr Speaker, knows that that would have been the result. So credit for stopping that happening goes to Winston Peters and, of course, to the extremely intelligent voters of Northland. Mr Speaker, while those excesses have been avoided, New Zealand First does want a bill which delivers speedier and cost-effective consent processes, but without compromising the fundamental provisions of the RMA. It must deliver a sensible, balanced and fair regime for RMA processes which avoid unnecessary costs and unnecessary delays. Now, Mr Speaker, I've myself in my previous life have had an involvement with a number of major consent processes, and as a result of that I've certainly learned that there were often excessive delays caused by submission processes which were repetitive and delivered very little additional useful information. And they were often purely submissions based on personal rather than environmental or public good interests as well. And they were often eye-wateringly expensive with very little to show, Mr Speaker, for that expense. But that doesn't mean that the submitters should be shut out because a lot can be done to simply streamline the RMA's processes without losing that value. And we also think that ways to make expert evidence more objective and more useful would also be worthwhile. Overall, the RMA's processes have caused too much cost and have caused too much delay with no real benefit arising from it. So New Zealand First does support, and I want to make this absolutely clear, New Zealand First does solidly support improvements in processes to the RMA to make it more useful, those processes more useful, and therefore the outcomes better, both for development and for the environment. However, New Zealand First will not commit to support this bill at this stage because we have identified already some major areas of concern, and there are at least 3 of those. Section 6, for example, requires that functionaries, quote, shall recognise and provide for specified matters of national importance, unquote. Included is, quote, the relationship of Maori and their culture and traditions with their ancestral lands, water, sites, wahi tapu and other taonga, unquote. And another is, quote, the protection of protected customary rights, unquote. We in New Zealand First want to know what all that really means and whether it means, for example, access to water rights which would not be available to other New Zealanders. If so, we'd be voting against the bill. Section 30 will also need careful scrutiny because it introduces a new function relating to what is called development capacity, requiring councils to ensure development capacity for residential and business land. On the face of it, nothing wrong with that, but the issue here is whether that new provision will result in an appropriate balance between environment and development objectives. Or will it really just ensure that the RMA becomes development-oriented and dominated? We'd like to explore that, Mr. Speaker. We're also concerned about the scope of the iwi participation agreements. There's very little in the bill which tells us what those will really be about and how far they will go. And we're especially concerned what participation in planning processes will mean in practice. It may be appropriate, but it may not be. And we want to know a whole lot more about that before we're prepared to commit our support. So, Mr. Speaker, in closing, New Zealand First will look forward to studying the detail of the bill to see just really what it does mean. Because I agree with what Eugenie Sage means. These are not really tinkering provisions, Mr. Speaker. They are, in some places at least, quite important changes that will require careful scrutiny. And, Mr. Speaker, we simply don't trust this government, and we don't trust the provisions that it's putting in this bill without adequately explaining why it's doing so. And we particularly don't trust it because of the backroom deals it appears to have been doing with some other parties. So we're going to take a good hard look at it before we're prepared to commit our vote in the future. We, Mr. Speaker, want to keep faith with the people who do want to achieve appropriate development, but also with those people who want to make sure that that is balanced with very good environmental security. So that's where we're coming from, and we'll tell you, and we'll tell the House ultimately whether we're satisfied with this bill or not as the further stages of it proceed.
I call the Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr. Speaker, when the original